Good afternoon. It's wonderful to be here hosting the third research webinar for our 21st Century California School Leadership Academy. We're so thrilled that all of you have decided to join us this afternoon. We know how busy your lives are and how much time you spend looking at a screen and participating in these different online engagements. And so we're just grateful that you have extended that to us this afternoon. We are thrilled to have a great webinar this afternoon that is called Leading Forward and how we might design equitable learning experiences and in these times of challenge. My name is Kim Wallace, and I'm the Associate Director of 21 CSLA State Center, and we have some wonderful presentations today from experts in the field and some really wonderful interactive opportunities for you to engage with each other as well. All right, so for those of you who are unfamiliar with 21 CSLA, we are in existence really here to support our school leaders and district leaders to create more equitable learning environments for our students, especially for the students who have been historically underserved. And we need to really make sure that we're focusing on one of the key tenets of our 21 CSLA work, which is about equity and its intersection with our digital learning environments that so many kids have been engaged in for now almost nearly a year. We have excellent partnerships as well with the California Department of Education, the State Board of Education, and the CCEE, which is the California Collaborative for Educational Excellence. I'm here to introduce our research presenters today. We have really wonderful experts who are going to be presenting on a variety of topics related to digital and distance learning. We have Dr. Nicole Howard, who's the Assistant Professor of the Department of Teaching and Learning for University of Redlands. And we have Dr. Charisse McBride, who's the Scholar of Digital Literacies and Teacher Learning and an expert consultant with ISTE. And so those wonderful folks are going to share with you some research and data and pose some questions and thoughtful opportunities for you to grow and stretch yourselves as learners. Our agenda is looking at essentially what I just said, doing the welcome and introduction right now. We'll have our research presentation with the principal voices, an opportunity for some self-reflection, breakout groups, and closing. So at this point, I'll turn it over to our presenters, and they will begin sharing some of the trends and data with you and have an opportunity to give you some of the research that they've learned in the recent time as well as within the last year. Welcome and thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for having us. Hello, everyone. Before diving in and discussing how we might lead forward, I'd like to offer our roadmap, a little bit more detail for you. Dr. McBride and I will begin with a data discussion to highlight some of the distance learning trends since the start of the COVID-19 pandemic. We will bridge research to practice, talk a bit about parent engagement, as well as designing for humanized learning. We would typically begin our talk by first unpacking some of the key terminology. However, due to some time constraints and given our hope of contextualizing information, there are some terms such as like digital divide, distance learning, that we'll mention early on in this talk, but then we'll unpack those terms later. And then also, as mentioned, we'll weave principal voices throughout our talk today. So yes, we're ready for that next slide as we begin to talk about the trends. One question still asked perhaps, is were schools ready to keep the learning going when the pandemic hit and schools closed? The Ed Week Research Center disseminated 2 surveys in spring 2020, one in March, one in April. Overall, 41% of about 2,600 teachers and district school leaders indicated that it was difficult to productively provide every child with e-learning and remote learning opportunities. When we move on to the next slide, we see the district's early responses. 46% of districts provided access to general resources. 38% provided formal curriculum but no instruction. Only 10% provided curriculum and instruction, of which about 5% of that group also engaged in progress monitoring. We know the importance of that particular data point. Progress monitoring is important because it does raise questions for us about how decisions could be made with regards to moving forward with teaching a unit or even reteaching a lesson. And so these data give us an idea of the challenges that were faced by districts, by teachers, by leaders. And even though parents and students weren't surveyed, we can infer from the data that there were some challenges that they were faced with as well during the early responses to the COVID-19 pandemic. So moving on to the next slide, we see district leaders' thoughts about the gap in technology. Interestingly, the lowest percentage of students from low-income families, we see those districts that have students from, there we go. We see that districts from the lowest percentages of students with low-income families, that just 21% of those districts leaders reported in late March that a lack of basic technology was a major concern, compared to about 2/3 of the leaders in districts where the highest percentages of students were from low-income families. So when we shift our attention just to the same slide, but just the other table, bar graph there, we see that from the teachers' perspectives, that in the first week of school closures, the percentage of teachers in the lowest income schools said that they were engaging in instruction, that amount was lower than the percentage of teachers in the higher income schools. So by about early April, the gap was narrowed considerably as we look down on that bar graph there. And we see that 85% of teachers in America's lowest income schools were now becoming more engaged in instruction. All right, so moving on to our next slide, takes us back to the question of preparation during the early responses to the COVID-19 pandemic. More specifically, we see here that in March 2020, 62% of district leaders from suburban districts and 73% of leaders from districts with the lower percentage of low-income students, more commonly called our high SES schools. Those leaders said that they were able to provide online learning opportunities for all students. But then a closer look at our rural and our high poverty districts, we see that we're well under half of leaders indicated they were able to provide the learning opportunities for all students in March 2020. Rural school districts, as we know, they face very unique and nuanced challenges related to digital equity. However, what the data are not showing us is the counter narrative. They're not showing us really how creative and innovative some of our rural districts have been in reaching students and reaching families. And so we'll have a chance to touch a bit more on that a little later in this talk as well. And so this brings us now to our next slide, which is our current data related to educators' responses to distance learning. These data that I'd like to share next are from a study initiated by the California Council on Teacher Education. They have a policy committee that is preparing for their Spring Policy Action Network conference that will be held next week on March 4th and 5th. A group of teacher educators that are members of this collective designed the questions for this study, and their purpose was to learn more about California educators' perspectives specifically, and really to understand what's happening and what their perspectives are right now, a year after COVID school closures, with the hope of informing future policy. Practices as well, but really trying to speak to the legislators and give them some insights into what we should be thinking about for future policies. As a co-chair of the California Council on Teacher Education's Policy Committee and co-chair of the conference next week, as well as co-director of the Real Lab at the University of Redlands, I had the privilege of actually leading the team and analyzing the data from this study. And so I'd like to share with you just a brief snapshot. And we can go ahead and move on to the next slide. This is a snapshot of key findings. And when the full report is available, I'd be happy to share so that you can see the full picture related to just not only our current educators in California, but also we asked some questions of our pre-service teacher candidates who are preparing to become future teachers in a completely online setting. As we move on to this slide here, I want to also mention that key terminology, distance learning, that I mentioned earlier. We would unpack some of those terms. Well, distance learning in the context of this particular study is defined as a method of studying in lectures that might be streamed online. It's learning from activities that are conducted just over the internet via Zoom, Google Meets, through an LMS without students physically meeting at on a school campus at a brick and mortar. And so here you see we had 387 educators from across the K-16 grade band. 81.3% of our participants were from K-12 public schools. We had representation from 189 districts across 45 counties, and you can see a couple of the counties named here, some rural, some suburban. We had a wide range of participants. So let's go ahead and take a look at some of the challenges. So I mentioned I would look at one question in particular, and we asked our participants, what are the challenges that they faced since the school year began? You can see here that top of the list, top two concerns were related to social isolation and social emotional well-being. We do see that the idea of learning loss was on the list. It wasn't at the very top, but it was a concern. However, in general, our California educators that were surveyed were very concerned about meeting the needs of all students. And on the next slide, we continue to see that addressing the student needs are very important across all demographics, meaning our English learners, our students who have been identified as having a disability. But what we also see here is that our California educators are concerned about engaging parents and families during this distance learning time. So considering the preliminary results of this study and what we know about educators and their concerns, we know that their concerns are about more than just devices. And I know Dr. McBride will talk more about that next level of the digital divide later. Our participants in this study were genuinely concerned about figuring out how to meet their students' needs in the distance learning environment, and then becoming more concerned about how they'll continue to meet their needs when we return back to our brick and mortar. So I think now we are moving on to our next slide, but I'm turning it back over to Kim to speak with us about one of our principal voices.
Thank you so much. This has been wonderful so far. We are looking at a principal who is from the Alameda Regional Academy in Berkeley Unified School District, and Jana Holmes has asked about how educators at the beginning of the pandemic scrambled to get themselves up to speed on the various technology tools. And then knowing that we're never really going to go back to what the past was, how can we really alter our professional development for educators in support of a more training centered around technology tools and pedagogy? And I'm going to stop sharing my screen at this point and give it back to the presenters so that they can respond to that question and take the presentation from here. Who's taking the next slide?
And so I think, oh, there we go. Thank you.
Thank you.
Great. Are you able to see my whole screen? All right. Thank you all. So I think this is a great question. As we look at what has happened over the past year, certainly I think that word scrambled is a great way to put it. Many of us as educators are thinking about how we can get tools into the hands of students. I remember what it was like as a professor too, thinking about how we can stay connected to students and making sure that we get the technology into students' hands. And I appreciate how this educator is talking about never, really going back to a normal that's familiar to us. I think we another thing that's come into our common conversation is this notion of the digital divide. We've seen lots of writing on it, and we continue to talk about how we can address that divide. And I want to add a little bit of nuance to that part of the conversation, as this level of access is probably the top thing in that conversation that we've been trying to address. As Nicole talked about earlier, and as is the focus of 21st century state partnerships here, the addressing underserved students' needs is huge. As part of my work in working with the California Department of Education's digital divide task force, we've talked about how the addressing hardware and software and making sure we have the infrastructure in schools to close this access divide is of prime importance. We've partnered with private entities looking at T-Mobile and these different internet service providers to make sure that we have, close those gaps. And that is hugely important, as we've seen, making sure that those tools and software are moving forward. But I think what we're not paying a lot of attention to is the second level divide. Do we have the capacity to support these technologies and to make sure that once students get those tools, how are they using them? Do we know how to use them as educators? Are we addressing these gaps that actually existed in many ways before the pandemic? Are our pedagogies aligning with the capacities and the logics of a digital ethos and the participatory ways that we can actually engage digital tools? We see that many schools that, and again, this is research over the last 20 years, schools that are outfitted with technologies still have gaps in the ways that they're used. You have some places that are using digital tools mostly for media consumption or just transferring analog pedagogies right onto those, transposing that into the digital environment, using lectures and trying to engage teacher-oriented uses of technology versus engaging those pedagogies that might, again, take advantage of the affordances like creative composition and allowing students to build on their own repertoires of practice with technology. The third level of the digital divide, which has the least amount of research on it and is becoming more and more pronounced in our sort of national conversations about digital divides, is how all of these gaps are mediated by different demographics of gender and race and inequities. And that's really where this conversation of digital inequity, which is where Nicole and I both do our research and practice, that's where that conversation comes in. And how are we making sure that these disparities are addressed with a sense of equity in mind, and the resources that are poured into pedagogy and infrastructure and these other areas are actually keeping in mind these inequities. So I think those levels of the digital divide continue to persist. Again, access is a huge one. Here, just last month, Pew Research released a report that demonstrates 12 million students are still without distance learning connections nationwide. And we see that many of these interventions, like the ones I mentioned with private, the private sector, are set to expire in the next 3 years. So were these, as was highlighted in the question, this is a new normal, but are we prepared to actually move forward with what's required in this new normal? If we have these different, discounts on software and the different resources that have been poured into public education, if they expire, then what's next? And so we have to continue to keep that in mind. We also see that some of these trends around the disparities in how low-income families are facing much more likelihood of their students not having access to remote learning, definitely the special education services not being available, and this second level divide again, where low-income families are saying that their kids' work is mostly or entirely busy work that they're getting online, sort of a sense of, packets or just checklists of things to do. These are, again, inequities that we need to think about. Lastly, I want us to challenge us to sort of widen our apertures as we think about distance learning, right? What is learning? How do we expand what we think about? First of all, the word distance. Where is, distance from what? Distance to what? What is, how do we potentially rearticulate what the center is and what we mean when we say distance? And if we shift that to imagining learning as happening in a social ecology and school just being one part of that. So if we think about the ecologies of which students are a part, it includes academics, but it also includes family and home and these social spaces of friendships and community, which we saw highlighted in the study as extra important. And we see what's happening. I'm the parent of a middle schooler, and I've seen how devastating it's been to not have those social connections. So if we imagine learning as participation, that students are participating and growing in their identities in all of these different spaces, and all of that counts as consequential learning, what might it look like for us to engage student-centered pathways to learning that takes into account their identity development and the ways that they might engage in activities that are consequential to them. I think Kim has another question from a principal here.
Yes, I am going to share my screen and bring our next principal voice up and get to the present. All right, so our next voice is from the Shasta Regional Academy, Chico Unified School District, and this is David McKay, who's a junior high school principal, and he talks about how they've done a lot of outreach for virtual real-time social, emotional, and organizational time management supports ready to go day one, but few people took advantage of that opportunity. So he would like to know, and I'm sure many people in this presentation who are participating right now would like to know, how can we really just much more effectively persuade families to take advantage of these services?
I think that it's a great question, and I think it's also a great segue into our poll next, because the poll, I think, will help us in answering this particular question. So if we could pose that question on our poll.
All right, so speaking of learning new digital tools, this is one that I was just recently introduced to, and so we're going to have an opportunity to hear from you about how you define parent engagement, and then this is a great tool that is going to show you in a word cloud what some of the responses are. So if you go ahead, you can do this in a couple of different ways. You can click on the link right here in the slide deck, which has been put into the chat for you. You can scan the QR code, which is in the corner of the screen, or you can just simply go to menti.com and use the code 5194943. And so choose whichever option you're most comfortable with, and it will bring you to, let's see if I can click it and show you, it brings you this website where you are just going to put in some different words that you are associating with parent engagement. So I'll give you a few minutes to do so, and then we'll take a look at the results together.
And just to note that you're also welcome to type in phrases if you'd like. It doesn't have to be single words.
All right, hopefully people have entered a few different words and phrases, and we're going to take another 30 seconds, rapid fire round, toss in whatever else you think is appropriate and defines parent engagement to you and your community, and then we'll take a look at what the results look like. All right, so let's see what the results come up as. And if I do this, and hopefully if I refresh, we will see something. Yay! All right, so take a look just to absorb some of the words that are coming up for participants. Would our researchers like to have any commentary on this before we move on to our next topic?
I would just signal that in David's question, the key thing he mentioned, of course, was about how do you engage families? How do you effectively engage? And I think what we're seeing in our word cloud here is that communication is important, right? And also a sense of empowerment. So how we are supporting our parents and helping them feel as though they are a part of the decision-making process. I saw decision-making come in earlier as well. I think these are some of the key things that we could be, have been, should be thinking about as we raise that question about how to effectively partner, is how I like to say it. How do we effectively partner with our parents?
And
Yeah,
if I
go ahead, Kim. We see a lot of words around that partnership: connection, partnership with families, support, responsiveness. I see communication. The words that are bigger, I think, they may have had more frequency. And so I can see that as being a reciprocity potentially, and this sense of empowerment. I also am appreciative of the word frustration, just kind of demonstrating an investment, that when we see parents frustrated, that shows that they're engaged and wanting to, feeling feeling some, having those feelings that result from not getting what, the outcomes that they'd like.
I just want to add to my 2 cents that I love that the word love came in there and that people thought about love being a parent engagement strategy. I think that's so wonderful. All right, so we're going to move back to our next principal voice, which is also David McKay, and he was very interested in hearing about how we continue to engage our students with interventions. And so they did virtual drop-ins, referral-based real-time interventions from day one when they were virtual 100% of the time. They advertised repeatedly, and very few students took advantage of the help. So he would like to know, how can we more effectively engage struggling learners through an online platform? And would you like me to share, stop sharing and give the screen back to you, Dr. McBride, or would you like me to continue?
No, it's okay to continue if you'd like, because I think it'll be just one more slide for me, and then we can hand over. But I think in response to David's question, I kind of capture it in this next slide, actually. It's a great question because we as educators put in a great deal of work in building, designing, implementing programs. And what I heard him ask was the question about, what do we do? And so we've probably heard that phrase, and I think Sharice and I kind of talked about this in our earlier meetings, that there's this idea of, and Kim, you were there too, there's this idea of if we build it, then they will come. But then us asking the question of, well, then who is the we? When we say we build it, then they'll come. Is it that I will build it, meaning I as the educator, I as the district, and then I assume that that means I'm meeting everyone's needs? Or is it we as in a collective with our parents? And so we know already that the LCAP goals call for inclusion of parents and families in the decision-making processes. Yet when the pandemic hit, it wasn't friendly. It didn't give us much time to truly include parents and families in the design of online experiences. And so now we have to take a moment and sort of step back and think about what we can do, where actually, in fact, if we do take that step back and go back to that point I raised earlier about our rural districts being creative, when they didn't have access to the technologies, they found very unique ways to connect with homes and families and parents. And so it's one of our more nuanced ways in my research that I've looked at parent engagement. Instead of just calling it parent engagement, we look at family engagement, beginning with asking the students, who is included in your family circle? Who do you define as family? And then including who they include in our conversations. So when we're wondering, instead of wondering why mom and dad aren't showing up, we know that if big brother or a cousin is showing up, that is who they define as a part of their family. We're also encouraging the conversations at home, meaning between families and a student, and counting that as a form of family engagement. In one of the recent studies that I have cited here, we actually found that parent engagement, family engagement in the form of conversations was one of the strongest predictors of achievement in mathematics, specifically for girls, and a very, very strong predictor for Black girls. So if we take a step back and think about how, not only how we're including student voice, but how we then are including more family members, and we're doing this under the understanding that this is collective work, us as educators in it with our families, we see different results. And so I always like to ask that question of course, who the students are identifying as members of their families. How are we encouraging those compassionate conversations? How are we engaging in the compassionate conversations with our families? Who are they saying is in their circle of support, and who are we including in their learning journeys? It's a shared responsibility, and we want to make sure that we are including all the right and key people in that equation, and most importantly, making sure we're including the people who our students are identifying as their family members. So I'll leave that here for now, but we will, of course, hopefully have time to talk more about what this might look like in your individual contexts.
All right, and our next principal voice, we're bringing back our friend Jana Holmes from Berkeley, and she is asking about how we can build upon teaching staff's newfound technology prowess to support learning loss, especially pronounced for students in some racial and socioeconomic groups.
I think that's a fabulous question, and I find it hopeful and encouraging that it's framed here as technological prowess that's been developed through this COVID learning environment. And so, assuming that that is the case, and that teachers have been able to build out some of their, you know, just fluency with technologies, or at least exposure in some ways, I think the key is, you can go ahead, being able to design for humanized learning. And you can go to the next slide and the next one after that. So in this notion of pedagogical design, there's two aspects to that. There's the sense that we can design learning, and then there's the sense I want to focus on as teachers, as designers. When we create conditions for participation, we're able to sort of widen the space that, as Nicole was describing, we take into account the like limitations and constraints of the current moment, and we expand that to really center the brilliance and the contributions of our students, their community cultural wealth, and co-design with community in order to highlight, like make space for what they are able to contribute in their own expertise. And then there's a sense that teachers have a lot of power and strength using our pedagogical content knowledge. We know how to teach, we know how to dream and think together, and we have our own existing repertoires of practice with technology. So as was highlighted in that question, we've already, whether it's using it in our personal lives, and then the exposure during teaching, the kinds of ways that this moment has opened new opportunities to continue learning technology, and some resources have been poured into that, workshops, webinars, engaging with our colleagues. We can continue to build on that and maintain a learner disposition moving forward. But one frame that's really useful for me is this notion of humanizing critical sociocultural knowledge. And that involved, this is from Kefferlin Brown, who thinks about the improvisational skills of teachers to again work beyond the constraints of the curriculum or of the moment, and to recognize the entrenched. It's particularly critical in that it recognized the entrenched historical disenfranchisement of certain communities, and is able to take this all-encompassing approach to do some self-reflection and to do reflection around like the positionality of our schools, and say, there's historical anti-Black racism, there's historical class disparities, and all these contextual factors that we need to address, and to design our learning environments that in ways that honor our students and their communities. And so I'm going to give an example of what that can look like in our pedagogical design. So this lesson, you can go ahead, is from a research study that I did where we had students, teachers, pre-service teachers. We tried to get them to design learning that would center that kind of sort of disposition of looking at context. And this one is for students who were in an English language development course, ELD level 1. And this particular teacher, April, focused on podcasting. She calls it Culture as Voice, podcasting with emergent bilinguals. And so you'll see this artifact here that she created, which was a model for her students using the SoundCloud platform. It's a web-based software, has a lot of free affordances. And so what her students were tasked with doing was creating a podcast that would center a folk tale from their own cultures, or from a story that had been passed down to them. I think her example here is just under 3 minutes long. She recorded her voice and then kind of put a picture to go with it. And you'll see these little guideposts that represented comments that she made as examples where you can offer comments to each other's podcasts. But this was sort of a 5-step process over the course of several days where she had her students listen to several podcasts from real world examples, including the one that she created just as a model for the class, to write a script of their podcast using several scaffolds for the ELD class, to record their audio, and then to upload it to the SoundCloud platform, and then include images and other multimodal elements. And then to comment on one another's podcasts, really emphasizing that collaborative part of the process. And so what I looked for in the research was what I call socioculturally situated understandings of technology integration. And this I think is really one of the core elements of thinking about how we design humanized learning. And what it is countering deficit narratives of non-dominant students. You can go ahead to the next slide. Being able to imagine beyond those limiting beliefs about our students, particularly in environments where our students are underserved, or kind of have these weights of what the mainstream may say about their abilities. So countering those deficit narratives of non-dominant students, embracing context as something that is woven throughout our pedagogy, woven throughout our technological choices, and woven throughout the content, the technology, and the pedagogy of what we do, and understanding that our designs will re-hyphen mediate learning. So rather than taking the approach of like traditional remediation, looking at our students as those who need sort of like an intervention that represents their a sense of lack, we understand that we need to shift the system of learning that they are engaged in, and that includes our whole activity system of how they are. We think about their home environments, we think about what they do in class, and we think about their strengths. And so in April's design, part of what I asked her for in all the cases that I worked with was a rationale that explained how she put her lesson together and why she did it that way. And so in this first example, she describes her choice of using podcasts. You can go to the next slide. Because these many forms, she talks about the communication styles that are in there. Because these many forms of communication converge in this media form, the podcast format also has great potential in an ELD classroom. I've decided to use podcasts for my sixth grade ELD students because it illustrates the real world implications for the convergence of speech and writing. So here she's looking at her choices of technology and pedagogy as rooted in her particular context of teaching, and that as her context of teaching and the choices that she's making as rooted in the the larger world of where this technology lives, where this kind of genre exists. And she talked earlier in the rationale also about the uses of podcasts and how they can be relevant for her particular students as well. The next slide highlights how she particularly pays attention to the dominant narratives about her students. She says, an emerging ELD classroom as mine is often feels isolated from real spoken English, with students repeatedly stating the ABCs or reading basic narratives of a day's activities. So rather than perpetuating these kinds of rote activities, she decides to engage a more rich assemblage of learning that will allow her students, again, to, as she describes, engage real spoken English, and to support them in something that can be more meaningful to their practice. And this last one is continues that same paragraph. Though they may be labeled as quote unquote unmotivated or disengaged, these students are not perhaps being engaged to the fullest extent by their curriculum. And this is what I was describing as re-mediating learning, where in describing them as unmotivated or disengaged, that puts a again a sense of lack on them or a deficit thinking about what their ability is. But instead, she is thinking about the curriculum as where the onus of responsibility or shifting of the activity can happen, and how this designing process then becomes about shifting that space of learning. And so I think what this demonstrates is that authorship and the ways that students engage technology can really address that second level divide, and their ways of using tools can have powerful, and I say that intentionally, powerful meaning for how they exist and how they develop their identities. And so she thinks about podcasting along her way to developing that lesson. We had a blog community where they kind of talked about what they were going to do later in the course, and she describes finally and most perhaps most importantly, podcasting reimagines a traditional teacher student paradigm in which teachers are the quote unquote owners of knowledge. In podcasting, students become the creators and can use their unique skills and voices to dictate a larger conversation. So here she is using the podcast as a lever more so than just something that students are going to consume. It's a lever for their brilliance to come through. And that is an example of student voice, which is one of the aspects of humanizing uses of technology. You can go to the next slide. Oh, we skipped that one. I just read from there. Go ahead and go to the next slide. Um, so in that, in those humanizing uses of technology, these are some of the keys that I'd like us to kind of take from this is being able to re-articulate authorship in ways that highlight students' expertise is one of the humanizing uses of technology that I'd like us to continue to think about. How do we engage student voice, promote collaboration, and use the affordances of digital tools to move toward digital composition? So all of these themes here really emerged in the data as I examined how students, or how teachers, I should say, my participants, revealed those socioculturally situated understandings of technology integration. They were able to really promote humanizing ways of looking at how technology would be used, in their instruction, providing those opportunities for what we call joint productive activity, students coming together to produce something and to engage in practices that are meaningful to them. They might do these online together. They may create something in their communities. The joint productive activity doesn't have to be with each other. It might be with their families and already existing activities in their lives. And that creates these student and family-centered pathways for engagement in blended learning environments, in online environments, but also in asynchronous environments. How can we move away from thinking about digitally mediated learning as only happening on screen? All right, and I think that's it for, we're going to move to kind of summarizing at this point.
So just want to recap and kind of go over a couple of our key learnings and hopefully things that you might also be thinking about. The work is challenging work, but it's collective work. I'm thinking back to the question of one of our principles around supporting teachers moving forward. And so this idea of collective work maybe even has us thinking differently about professional development and how we are bringing educators together, teachers together across campuses, across districts, across counties in order to feel supported and to learn together. When looking to bridge the research highlights from earlier related to educators' concerns about social isolation and social emotional well-being of students, it's really important that we do hear from them and what their needs are and continue to work together to develop and determine what the next steps are, and remembering to include our students' voices and our parents. So sort of a step back to step forward, if you will.
We keep talking about this new normal, the second key learning. We're planning for a future that we cannot predict. And I think that requires new practices and new disposition. One of those new practices is co-design. We are teachers and educators, we've had to step back and say, we're learning right along with you. We don't know every step of the way. We have these models that we've relied on, and they don't always work for this new environment. And so let's have compassionate conversations and let's move forward with a disposition of learning and iteration, being able to acknowledge this didn't work and now we need to shift, and we are not the center anymore. If we didn't know that before, we have to know it now, because our parents, our co-teachers, our co-learners, all of that in this process with us.
Third, we really want to think beyond devices. And as we think beyond devices, I think that idea of dreaming big and designing beyond devices starts to happen. And it seems, counterintuitive because we're in a situation where devices are key to the learning. But, one thing we want to focus on is really attending to things such as the mentoring, the coaching, of course, the professional development, thinking about the pedagogy first, allowing the tool to enhance from there, but dreaming big and dreaming beyond the devices.
And finally, as we talk about distance learning, humanizing pedagogies are what will bridge that distance in the distance learning. Are those steps that I described about how we can engage those humanizing pedagogies? We've been talking so much about, as we saw in Dr. Howard's research, we need to make those connections with our students, and the social emotional piece has really risen to the top. It's really about being able to engage those needs of our students, and the technology cannot do that alone. So let's think about how we will humanize the way that we teach and put that at the center.
Next, we have a little bit of time for you to reflect on some of the incredible work that our researchers have presented to you. And so just going to take a few minutes to pause and reflect on the content. And you can just jot down with pen and paper, do it old school style, or you can type it on your computer and just hear a couple of reflection frames that you might want to think about. So number one is I was struck by. 2, I'm wondering. 3, a connection I made. And 4, I plan to. So we'll just all pause for a moment and let you reflect on those questions. All right, That wasn't quite 5 minutes, but we want to give you a chance to talk with your colleagues in some of the breakout rooms. And so we're going to keep on moving. And we have breakout rooms that are being set up at this moment. And you have the opportunity to stay in the main room if you like, or you can join one of the breakout rooms that you'll be invited to shortly. Just introduce yourselves, name, affiliation, and role very quickly, and then you'll have an opportunity to discuss one or more of the questions on the next slide and note your discussion on a shared Google Doc, and they will miraculously appear in the chat for you so that you will have the Google Doc access there, as well as the breakout group discussion questions. So I'll go ahead and show the questions to you and give you a chance to read those as they are going into the chat as well. The first one is about hearing the voices of our students and families, and how do we pursue that in a really authentic way and find the insights and tools that can help us. And then the second one is about co-designing digitally mediated learning with our community in our own contexts. And we have people from across the state of California here, so it should be a rich discussion depending on your community. And then you could also pose a wondering to your group and discuss and create responses to those wonderings. So when you go to the Google Doc, each page has one of these questions on it, and we will go ahead and send you to your groups to have that conversation. I will stop sharing my screen at this point. All right, well, welcome back from the breakout groups. Hopefully you had some excellent conversations and met some great new people, and we'll turn it back over to our research team to talk about some of the concluding observations that they have based on your responses as well as some of their own findings.
If you want to jump.
Start.
I was just about to ask you the same thing. I saw you active engaging there on the doc, so I wasn't sure if you might be ready to jump in. I can maybe just start with the first one and then go from there. So in looking at some of the things that are coming up, I think this is just right on it in line with what we're talking about. It's thinking about very different ways that we can connect with families, reaching out to them, doing more than the email and the text. I think that these are critical steps to think about. There's someone who is coming up on my screen as Anonymous Loris, whoever that is, who is typing that last point there, reimagining the relationships with parents or families in a personal way. That really speaks to me, and just thinking about my own experiences, not just as a researcher, but also as a parent myself, and thinking about how my son's teacher, he's in 5th grade, and how his teacher has really found unique ways to reimagine the relationship with us as parents. No one could have imagined that we'd have this situation. So I think it does call for us to think a bit differently about how we engage families, and then also redefining it. So you'll notice that I keep saying families and not just saying parents, because I think right now there are students at home who are not just with their parents, they're with their families while they're learning. So I'm also seeing here that we have to perhaps even think about how we're asking them about the learning that's been happening, and not just us giving the information about the learning that has been happening, because we have people who are in the homes who are seeing it firsthand, how the learning has been happening for the past year. Charisse, I'll pass it back to you.
I think, these questions around like co-design, I appreciate these insights. So finding ways to value the differences, that's really powerful and important. It made me think about knowing, you have to if you want to know the differences, I mean, you want to value the differences, you have to know them first. So even related to the other question, I think highlighting the brilliance and getting to know our students through their families too, and through asking them, like starting out with just being able, like I remember being asking my kids' teachers, like, can you tell me what are some of her strengths? And they couldn't answer that question. Like, that does not feel good. If you want to co-design learning, you got to know some of the strengths and, quote unquote differences of our kids. And I think being able to again, yes, invite parents and community members to share their work. That's a great idea. And um, any of these partners that we can engage, whether that's through inviting them in, or I think it's always kind of mind blowing for kids when they see people from other spaces, like within, whether it's like running into your teacher at the grocery store. But when we take that step to invite parents, community members, take advantage of being online and allowing folks to visit your classroom and share what they do, let students, um, you know, share some of the activities that they're doing in other spaces and get insights from what they're learning, like what organic learning is happening in those spaces, and build on that. I think those are good partners. And one value that I want to highlight is reciprocity. How can we make sure that we're not just doing this unidirectional designing and work, but that we recognize that it's a reciprocal relationship?
And I think our final point is looking at the wonderings for each group. And I think many of us are wondering that same thing about how long it'll take for us to become comfortable with new technology. And it's such a difficult question to pin down and answer because technology is going to forever evolve. And it seems like we'll always have something new. But for our teachers, encouraging them to focus on digital literacy is perhaps, one helpful approach. Continuing to encourage them to think about the social emotional well-being of students first as a priority, and then allowing the pedagogy to in the humanizing learning experience to then help determine what tools are introduced, I think is key. So it's really, I think, more about how we're prioritizing the experience, or what we're prioritizing within the learning experience for students. And sometimes taking it back to the basics when we say digital literacy. The plus means you add something. The very basics sometimes can give someone new to technology so much confidence in navigating a new tool when they see all the same similar buttons across each platform. So just one thought to add there. But I really do appreciate the reciprocity component as well, because I think that it also speaks to how we might position students as experts, that other wondering, and thinking about giving students an opportunity to bring more of themselves into the learning experience will also add some value, especially when we go back to being whatever the new thing will be. Really how we engage our students will be an important component in terms of, we always say engagement is a big thing anyway, but they now have been doing so much on their own, and how do we tap into that and support them will be key.
I want to say one last thing, just briefly, that part about digital literacies is so powerful, because I think that's the key to being able to position them as experts. Like when you talk about the functions of technology, we can step back and allow our students to be like the geniuses that help us know what to do and to build on their repertoires of practice. How do what looks familiar about this tool? Sometimes I know teachers are afraid to like introduce something new, but we can ask them what's familiar about this, the uploading, the ability to participate with your peers, and kind of go from there, and also engage their non-digital kind of literacies and say, this is a discourse community, just like what you do when you play basketball, but we have to go on their territory in a sense, like things that may not be familiar to us, allow them to teach us about that too. I think that ends up being a way to build skills and just around what they like.
This has been a fantastic conversation, and it reminds me of the phrase, there is no there. We're always going to be evolving and learning new technologies, and we don't have to be the expert in everything, and it really is a partnership. And so we appreciate the partnership with you Dr. McBride and Dr. Howard today to share with us your insights and to have the group generate insights as well. As always, we have a session feedback form for the participants who are here, and we will give you a few minutes at the end of this presentation to click on that link and just give us a few quick responses to the questions that we pose. Whatever you give us as feedback, we act upon and try to make each of the next webinars and our collectives a lot better. And so anything that you have to share with us, we're very hopeful and welcome to hear. And that should be put into the chat too if you need the link. And as always, we have announcements and reminders for upcoming events and activities and opportunities. And we're very excited that starting on March 17th, we have a partnership with the California Subject Matter Project, who are going to be hosting and delivering a professional learning series for regional academies across the entire state. And it is about inquiry and how leaders can foster and support equitable access to inquiry-based instruction in an online environment, which is a great dovetail to the presentation that we just had here today. And then following in March 24th, we have a research webinar by our very own Dr. Jabari Mahiri, and he is going to talk about reframing race and educational leadership to right the wrongs of race. And this is going to be another very deep and complex and energizing and engaging webinar, just like the one that we had today. Just want to say thank you to all the participants as well as our researchers, and we hope that you attend future activities with 21 CSLA, and we are always appreciative of your participation and the connections that we make with each other, because we are not alone. We are here to elevate school and education and learning experiences for staff as well as students, and we are happy to be able to provide that service to you. Thank you.